The men of Providence Creek measured their worth in cords of wood. By late October, their stacks stood like small fortresses against the clappered walls of their homes, monuments to foresight and hard labor. The wood was a catechism, spoken in oak, pine, and ash. This is how a man provides. This is how a family survives. This is the wall we build against the white death of winter. The stacks were uniform in their construction, following a logic passed down from fathers to sons. They were raised off the ground on runners to prevent rot, open to the air to stay seasoned, and close to the house for convenience. It was the way things were done. It was the only way. Elam had no such fortress. His small cabin, built on a less desirable plot at the edge of the settlement, looked naked and vulnerable. Where a proud wall of split logs should have been, there was only bare earth. He was young, a recent arrival, and a widower. The pity the community held for him was a thin, brittle thing, easily cracked by suspicion. He was quiet, which they mistook for slow-wittedness, and he worked with a strange, methodical intensity that they found unsettling. He did not ask for help, nor did he offer his own unless directly solicited, and in a place built on the currency of mutual obligation, this made him an outsider. Silas Blackwood, the founder and de facto patriarch of Providence Creek, saw Elam's empty yard not just as a failure of preparation, but as an affront. Blackwood was a man carved from the same timber he stacked against his own large house. His hands were thick with calluses, his beard was shot through with gray, and his pronouncements carried the weight of scripture. He had led the first families into this valley, had chosen the site for the meeting house, and had negotiated the treaty with the last of the Sioux who passed through. His woodpile was the largest in the settlement, a veritable cathedral of fuel that rose nearly to his roofline. One crisp afternoon, Blackwood and two other town elders, Josiah Field and Thomas Vance, made their way toward Elam's property. It was not a social call. It was an inspection, an inquest into the boy's apparent foolishness. The wind had a new edge to it, a razor honed on the distant, unseen ice of the north. The squirrels had been frantic for weeks, and the geese had fled south earlier than anyone could remember. The signs were clear. A hard winter was coming. A winter that would test the righteous and punish the fool. They found Elam not idling in despair, but working. He was in the center of his yard with a shovel and pickaxe, drenched in sweat despite the chill. He was digging a hole. It was not a root cellar, nor a well. It was a massive, rectangular pit, already deeper than Elam was tall and 3 times as long. The pile of excavated earth beside it was a mountain of black soil and clay. Silas Blackwood stopped at the simple fence line, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "Elam," he called out, his voice a low rumble. "What is the meaning of this foolishness? A man's time is better spent with an axe in his hand this time of year, not a shovel." Elam paused, planting the shovel in the earth. He wiped a sleeve across his brow, leaving a smear of dirt. He looked at the 3 men, his expression unreadable. "I am tending to my firewood, Mr. Blackwood." Josiah Field, a wiry man whose face was a roadmap of past hardships, let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Tending to it? Boy, you haven't even cut it. Your yard is as bare as a sinner's cupboard. Are you planning to burn dirt this winter?" "My wood is cut," Elam said, his voice quiet but steady. He gestured with his head toward the woods behind his cabin. The men followed his gaze and saw it then. A truly staggering amount of wood, all cut, split, and neatly stacked in long rows between the trees. It was easily 10 cords, maybe more. It was a season's work, done in silence and secrecy. The sight of it gave them a moment's pause. The boy had worked, there was no denying that. But their surprise quickly curdled back into disbelief. Thomas Vance, the town's portly storekeeper, squinted. "Then why is it out there in the woods? And what is this grave you're digging?" "I'm not digging a grave," Elam replied, turning back to his work. "I'm building a cellar for the wood." The three men stared at him. The concept was so alien, so contrary to all known wisdom, that they could not immediately process it. Blackwood was the first to find his voice. "You're going to bury it?" he asked, the words slow and heavy with condescension. "You're going to take good, seasoned oak and pine and bury it in the damp earth?" "Yes," Elam said, without looking up. He drove the pickaxe into a stubborn layer of clay, the impact jarring his thin frame. Blackwood stepped through the fence, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, excavated dirt. He walked to the edge of the pit and peered in, as if expecting to find the boy's sanity at the bottom. "Son," he said, adopting the tone of a patient father explaining the world to a simple child, "let me tell you something. Earth is wet. Even when it looks dry, it holds the damp. You put that wood in the ground, and by the time the first snow falls, it'll be soaked through. It'll start to rot. What doesn't rot will freeze solid. You won't be able to burn it any more than you could burn a river stone. The frost will lock that wood into a block of ice and dirt." He looked to his companions for confirmation. They nodded solemnly. "It's true, boy," Field added. "We've all seen it. A log falls off the stack, gets half buried in the mud. By January, you'd need a blacksmith to get it loose, and even then, it would just hiss and spit in your stove." "This is woman's folly," Blackwood declared, his patience exhausted. "It's the kind of backwards thinking you'd expect from someone who doesn't understand this land. You are condemning yourself. When the real cold comes, when the blizzards hit, you will have nothing. Your foolishness will kill you." Elam finally stopped his work. He straightened his back, which ached with a fire that nearly matched the one in his heart. He looked directly at Silas Blackwood, his gray eyes clear and unwavering. "I will see this through." The simple finality of the statement infuriated Blackwood. It was not defiance, not arrogance, but a quiet confidence that was somehow more galling. It was the confidence of a man who believed he knew better. "Then see it through alone," Blackwood pronounced, his voice dropping to the cold, hard tone he used for final judgments. "Providence Creek is a community. We help our own. But we do not reward willful idiocy. When your fire dies and the frost is on your walls, do not come knocking on our doors. There will be no help for you here. You will be a lesson to the rest of us on the price of pride." He turned and strode away, Field and Vance following in his wake like acolytes. They did not look back. It was a sentence, a formal excommunication from the fragile society of the frontier. Elam was now truly on his own. He watched them go, then took a deep breath of the cold, sharp air. He picked up his shovel. There was much work still to be done. He did not hate them for their scorn. He understood it. They were men of proven methods, of traditions forged in the crucible of hard-won survival. Their knowledge was a fortress, and he was attacking its very foundations with nothing but a shovel and a memory. The memory was of his grandfather, a man from the old country, a place of mountains so high they scraped the clouds, and winters so long they had 100 different words for snow. His grandfather, Stephen, had been a trapper, a man who lived outside of villages, who understood the deep, silent language of the forest. He had a face like a weathered map, and hands that could gentle a frightened horse or build a shelter from nothing but what the woods provided. As a boy, Elam had sat by the fire, mesmerized by his grandfather's stories. Stories of wolves with eyes like yellow lamps, of trees that slept through the winter, and of the earth itself, the Zemlya, as a living, breathing thing. "The earth has a slow, warm breath, little one," Stefan would say, his voice a low rasp like stones rubbing together. "Men build their houses on top of her, and they shiver when the wind blows. They forget that the real warmth, the deep warmth, is always beneath their feet. The winter can take everything on the surface. It can turn the rivers to stone and the trees to glass. But it cannot reach the heart of the earth. Her heart is always beating, always warm." After his grandfather passed, Elam had inherited a small, leather-bound journal. It was filled with his grandfather's cramped, angular script and detailed sketches drawn with charcoal and berry juice. It was a book of secrets, an almanac of forgotten wisdom. Most of it was in the old tongue, which Elam had learned at his grandfather's knee. For years, the journal had been a keepsake, a memento of a lost world. Now, it was his Bible. When his wife Anya had taken ill on the trail west, her breath growing shallow and her skin as pale as winter birch, he had felt a helplessness so profound it had nearly hollowed him out. He had followed the doctor's advice, the conventional wisdom, and it had failed. She was buried now under a different patch of unforgiving earth, 1,000 miles behind him. Her loss had instilled in him a deep and abiding distrust of the common way, the accepted truth. It had driven him back to the strange, wild knowledge of his grandfather. In the lonely nights in his new cabin, he had read the journal from cover to cover. And there, on a page yellowed with age, he found it. A detailed drawing labeled Zemlyanka Drova, a wood-earth cellar. The entry was not just a sketch, it was a treatise, a scientific explanation rooted in generations of observation. His grandfather wrote of how the frost line, the depth to which the winter cold could penetrate the soil, was a barrier. In their land, it might go 3, even 4 feet deep. But below that, the earth maintained a constant, stable temperature, cool in the summer, but crucially above freezing in the winter. This was the geothermal principle, a scientific term his grandfather would not have known, but a natural law he understood with intimate, practical clarity. The journal explained the process in painstaking detail. It was not simply a matter of digging a hole and throwing the wood inside, as Blackwood and the others assumed. That would indeed lead to rot and ice. No, it was a work of engineering. First, the pit had to be dug below the frost line. For this land, Elam estimated that to be at least 5 feet, so he dug to 6 for good measure. The bottom of the pit could not be flat earth. It required a bed of coarse gravel and flat stones, angled slightly toward a sump in one corner. This was for drainage. Any moisture that seeped in would be drawn away from the wood, collecting where it could do no harm. The walls were the next critical step. Direct contact with the soil would transfer moisture into the wood. The journal showed a sketch of men peeling massive sheets of bark from birch trees. Birch bark, his grandfather wrote, was the earth's own oilcloth, a waterproof skin that the forest provided. It had to be harvested carefully, from fallen trees if possible, and layered like shingles against the earthen walls, overlapping to ensure no gaps. The stacking of the wood itself was an art, not thrown in haphazardly, but laid in crisscrossing layers, creating a matrix of air channels. Wood must breathe, even when it sleeps, the journal read. This circulation was vital, preventing the buildup of mold and allowing any residual moisture to evaporate and condense on the cooler bark walls, rather than soaking into the fuel itself. Finally, there was the roof. It couldn't be a simple lid. It had to be a living part of the earth. The plans showed a framework of thick logs laid over the pit, covered with layers of birch bark, and then topped with a thick blanket of the excavated soil, a foot or more deep. This sod roof would insulate the cellar, using the earth itself to shield the wood from the surface cold. A small, square opening would be left for access, sealed with a heavy, double-planked trapdoor, itself insulated with packed wool and cured hides. This was the blueprint Elam was following. This was the source of his quiet confidence. He was not gambling on a whim. He was placing his faith in the accumulated wisdom of his ancestors, in a science that predated the men who now mocked him. He was building his fortress not against his house, but within the earth itself. The labor was immense, a solitary war waged against the hardening ground and the shortening days. The first 2 feet of topsoil were easy enough, but then he hit a dense layer of clay, slick and heavy. The pickaxe became his primary tool, each swing a jarring blow that traveled up his arms and settled as a deep ache in his shoulders. He worked from sunup to sundown, his world shrinking to the rectangle of earth he was carving out of the prairie. His hands, soft from the long journey, blistered, then bled, then hardened into thick, clumsy leather. He ate standing up, quick meals of hardtack and jerky, his mind already on the next phase of the project. At night, he would fall onto his cot, too exhausted to dream, and wake before the dawn, his muscles screaming in protest. But the image of Anya's pale face and the memory of his own powerlessness was a fire in his gut that burned hotter than any physical pain. He would not be helpless again. He would not be a victim of the cold. After a week of digging, the pit was complete. It was a clean, sharp-edged wound in the earth. He spent the next 2 days hauling stones from the creek bed, his back bowing under the strain. He laid the drainage floor with the precision of a stonemason, ensuring the slight, perfect grade. Harvesting the birch bark was a more delicate task. He ventured deep into the aspen groves where the birches grew, searching for trees felled by wind or age. He peeled the bark away in great papery sheets, careful not to tear them. It smelled of wintergreen and damp earth. He carried it back on a makeshift travois, load after load, until he had a small mountain of the white, pliable material. Lining the pit took another 2 days, fitting the pieces together, overlapping them, creating a seamless, waterproof barrier between his wood and the clay walls. Then came the wood. He had spent the better part of a month felling, bucking, and splitting, working with a feverish energy that had exhausted him but left him with a deep sense of satisfaction. Now, he had to move all 10 cords from the tree line into the pit. He used a wheelbarrow, a tool that seemed to mock him with its small capacity. Each trip was a slow, grueling journey. He began the stacking following the crosshatch pattern from his grandfather's journal, his mind a study in geometry and airflow. During this long, arduous process, the mockery from the town continued. It became a form of local entertainment. Children would creep to the edge of his property and call out, "Digging to China, Elam?" before running away, giggling. The women, gathering at Vance's store, would whisper about that poor, touched boy, shaking their heads in pity. The men were more direct. A farmer on his way back from the grist mill stopped his wagon. "Still at it, boy? I've got a good stack of oak I'll sell you come January. Price will be steep, of course. For fools." He laughed and flicked the reins, leaving Elam in a cloud of dust. Silas Blackwood made his daily walk past the property a ritual of silent condemnation. He would pause, look at the deepening pit and the slowly growing stack of wood within it, and shake his head with the profound disappointment of a king observing a hopelessly inept subject. He never spoke to Elam again, but his message was clear in every line of his rigid posture. You are a fool, and your death will be of your own making. Elam ignored them all. Their words were wind. The earth, the wood, the sweat on his brow, these were the only real things. He sealed the pit with heavy logs, layers of bark, and finally, the thick blanket of sod. He fashioned the trap door, packing it with scraps of wool from a worn-out blanket and the hide of a deer he'd shot for meat. When he was done, all that remained of his weeks of Herculean labor was a low, gentle mound in his yard, barely distinguishable from the surrounding prairie, with a single square of wood set in its center. He had finished just in time. That night, the temperature plummeted. The first snow fell, not a gentle dusting, but a hard, driving sleet that coated every surface. The winter that followed was not merely a season, it was an invading army. The old-timers called it the Iron Freeze. It began with a day of unnatural warmth, a weather breeder that melted the early snow into a slurry of mud and water. Then, the sky turned a strange, bruised purple, and the temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single hour. A freezing rain began to fall. It was not rain as they knew it. It was supercooled water that turned to solid ice the instant it touched any surface. It fell for 12 straight hours. Twigs became glass daggers. Tree branches grew heavy and thick as a man's arm. Fences were transformed into glittering, impenetrable walls. The world was encased in a shell of clear, perfect ice, a quarter-inch thick. And then came the cold. It was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down from the Arctic, driving the temperature to depths no one in Providence Creek had ever experienced. 40 below zero, and then colder. The wind came with it, a relentless, scouring force that found every crack and chink in their well-built cabins, shrieking like a banshee. For the first week, the settlers felt secure. They had their wood, their stores, their thick walls. The men would make quick, brutal trips to their woodpiles, bundled so heavily they could barely move. And that is when they discovered the true nature of the iron freeze. Their woodpiles, the pride of their homesteads, were useless. The freezing rain had soaked the outer layers of the logs, and the subsequent cold had welded them together into a single, solid mass. The entire surface of each stack was a contiguous sheet of ice. But the more insidious problem lay within. The moisture present in all seasoned wood, the small percentage that remained deep in the fibers, had frozen solid. The wood had become frost-locked. When a man brought his axe down on a normal piece of oak, the steel wedge followed the grain, forcing the fibers apart. But now, the ice held those fibers together with the strength of iron. Axes bounced off the logs with a dull, metallic thud, the impact sending painful vibrations up the user's arms. When a blade did manage to bite in, it didn't split the wood, it chipped it, sending out frozen shards that were as useless for burning as gravel. Panic began as a low murmur. Men spent hours outside in the brutal cold, swinging their axes with frantic energy, only to return with a handful of splinters and frostbitten fingers. They began burning through their ready supply, the small stacks they kept in boxes by the hearth. Those lasted a day, maybe two. Then, they started burning furniture, a broken chair, an old crate, a spinning wheel that had belonged to a grandmother. The fires in Providence Creek, which had always been a symbol of warmth and security, became hungry, desperate things, consuming the very fabric of their homes. The narrative now shifts to Silas Blackwood. He sat in his main room, which was now confined to the area directly around the hearth. The rest of the house was an icebox. His wife, Sarah, and their 2 young children were huddled under a mountain of quilts on the floor, their faces pale and pinched. The fire in the great stone fireplace was little more than a pile of glowing embers. The last of the kitchen chairs lay in a pile of charred remains. Silas had spent the morning outside, his pride stripped away by the sheer, implacable physics of the cold. His magnificent woodpile, the largest in the settlement, was now a monument to his own folly. It was a glittering, useless sculpture of ice and wood. He had swung his heaviest maul until his arms were numb and his lungs burned, and had managed to produce only a basketful of icy chips that hissed and steamed in the fire, giving off more smoke than heat. Fear was a cold knot in his stomach, colder than the air outside. He looked at his son, whose breath was pluming in the air inside their own home, and saw his own failure. He had been so certain, so arrogant. He had pronounced judgment on the boy Elam, had condemned him to freeze, and now that same fate was clawing at his own door. The thought of Elam struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had dismissed the boy, mocked him. He had pictured Elam's cabin as a tomb, the boy himself frozen solid, a grim testament to the importance of following the wisdom of one's elders. But what if he was wrong? The thought was so heretical it almost made him laugh, a harsh, cracked sound. Wrong? Him? Silas Blackwood? But the evidence was all around him. The dying fire, the shivering children, the useless mountain of wood outside. His wisdom had failed. Catastrophically. A desperate, terrible hope began to dawn. The boy's plan had been insane. Burying wood? It defied all logic. But it was the only logic that hadn't yet been proven false. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse, "I'm going out." "Silas, no!" she pleaded from under the quilts. "There's nothing more you can do. You'll freeze." "I'm going to Elam's place," he said. The name felt strange on his tongue. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To see—" She couldn't finish the sentence. To see the boy's frozen corpse. "To see if I was wrong," he whispered. Bundling himself in every layer he owned, he stepped out into the howling, crystalline world. The wind was a physical blow that stole his breath. The short distance to Elam's cabin, a casual walk in summer, was now a perilous journey. The snow was crusted over with ice, and he slipped and fell twice, the impact jarring his bones. He pushed on, driven by the image of his son's face. He was not just walking to Elam's cabin, he was on a pilgrimage of atonement. He expected to find the place dark and silent, a snow-drifted mound that marked a grave. As he drew closer, stumbling through the wind, he shielded his eyes and looked for the cabin. And then he saw it. A light. A small, yellow square of light in the window. And something else. A thin, gray plume of smoke rising from the stone chimney. It did not whip and dissipate instantly in the gale. It was a steady, confident stream, the kind of smoke that comes from a hot, well-fed fire burning dry wood. And beneath the shriek of the wind, he could smell it. The clean, sharp scent of burning oak. He staggered to the door, his mind reeling. The warmth of his hope warred with the chill of his disbelief. He raised a gloved fist and knocked, the sound loud and hollow in the frozen silence. He half expected no answer. The door opened. A wave of heat, thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, washed over him. It was so profound, so shocking, that he physically recoiled. Elam stood in the doorway. He was wearing a simple wool shirt, his sleeves rolled up. Behind him, a magnificent fire roared in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the warm, comfortable room. A book lay open on a small table. Elam was not just surviving. He was living. Silas Blackwood, the patriarch of Providence Creek, the man of iron certainty, could only stand there, his beard encrusted with ice, and stammer a single, broken word. How? Elam did not smile. He did not gloat. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a quiet, weary understanding. He simply stepped aside and gestured for Blackwood to enter. The warmth of the cabin enveloped Silas like a benediction. He stumbled inside, his frozen limbs beginning to ache as they thawed. He looked at the fire, at the calm young man, at the simple, profound comfort of the room. "Your wood," Silas began, his voice failing him. "How is it not frozen?" Elam put on a heavy coat and pulled on his boots. "Come," he said, "I will show you." He led the bewildered man back out into the maelstrom. He walked to the low, snow-covered mound in his yard, the place the children had called Elam's Folly. He took a spade and cleared the snow from the heavy trap door. With a grunt of effort, he heaved it open. Silas peered into the darkness, his eyes slowly adjusting. A ladder led down into the earth. A faint, earthy smell, clean and cool, rose from the opening. Elam lit a lantern and descended, beckoning for Silas to follow. Hesitantly, Silas climbed down. He found himself in a small cavern of neatly stacked wood. The air was cool, but not cold. It was the stable, still temperature of a cellar. He reached out a hand and touched a split log. It was dry. It was cool to the touch, but there was not a single crystal of ice on it. It felt like wood in September. He picked it up. It was heavy, solid, and ready for the fire. He looked around at the walls of layered birch bark, at the stone-lined floor, at the intricate, crisscrossed stacking that allowed the air to move. This was not a grave. It was a vault, a treasure chest of warmth. He looked at Elam, who was watching him with those same steady gray eyes. All the pride, all the arrogance, all the certainty that had defined Silas Blackwood's life crumbled to dust in that moment. He saw not a boy, but a man of profound and ancient wisdom. He saw not folly, but a genius that had saved them all. "I was wrong," Silas said, the words tasting of ash and humility. "We called it folly. We were the fools." He looked at the life-saving wood, then back at Elam. "You saved us." Elam simply nodded. He handed Silas a canvas sling. "Take what you need for your family," he said. "Then send the others." Silas climbed out of the pit, his arms loaded with dry, perfect oak. As he trudged back towards his own cold home, he saw other figures struggling through the snow, drawn by the impossible sight of smoke from Elam's chimney. Josiah Field, Thomas Vance. One by one, the men who had mocked him were now coming to his door, their faces etched with desperation and dawning shame. Elam's small cabin became an ark. For the rest of the iron frieze, a steady procession of men made the pilgrimage to his yard, descending into the earth to retrieve the wood that meant the difference between life and death. Elam asked for nothing in return. He simply shared what he had. His silence, a more profound statement than any words of reproach could ever be. When the great cold finally broke and the thaw began, the world of Providence Creek had been irrevocably changed. The ice melted, revealing the scars of the winter, but also a new social order. Elam was no longer the outcast, the strange, touched boy. He was Elam the wise, the man who had listened to the earth. His debt at Thomas Vance's store was canceled, the ledger entry crossed out with a thick, dark line. When the town council met, a chair was always left empty for him at the head of the table, an open invitation. He rarely took it, which only increased their respect for him. One mild day in early spring, a delegation of every able-bodied man in the settlement arrived at his cabin. Silas Blackwood stood at their head, his hat in his hands. "Elam," Blackwood said, his voice clear and steady for all to hear, "we did not listen to you, and we nearly paid the ultimate price for our pride. We ask now that you teach us. Teach us what you know. Teach us the way of your grandfather." And so, Elam taught them. He did not lecture. He led them into the woods and showed them how to read the land, how to find the right spot for a cellar, away from the water table. He brought out his grandfather's journal and, with painstaking patience, translated the old words and explained the intricate drawings. They dug together. All the men of Providence Creek, their shovels rising and falling in unison, dug a new, much larger cellar near the meeting house, a communal reserve for the widows and the infirm. They learned how to lay the stone floor, how to harvest and place the birch bark, and how to stack the wood so it could breathe. They worked under his quiet instruction, their earlier mockery replaced by a deep, attentive reverence. They learned that the earth was not an enemy to be conquered, but an ally to be understood. From that year forward, a low, sod-covered mound became as essential to a homestead as a well or a barn. They were called Elam pits, or sometimes winter cellars. The practice spread to neighboring settlements, carried by travelers who told the story of the iron freeze and the strange young man who buried his wood. Elam himself changed very little. He remained quiet, observant, and self-sufficient. But he was no longer alone. The community, bound to him by the debt of their very lives, wove him into their fabric. He was the first to be invited to a barn raising, the first to be consulted when the signs of the seasons seemed strange. Years later, when Elam was an old man with a face as weathered as his grandfather's had been, he would sit with the children of Providence Creek by his own warm fire. He would tell them the story of the iron freeze, not as a tale of his own wisdom, but as a lesson about the danger of pride and the enduring power of listening to the quiet, ancient voices, the voices of the ancestors, and the slow, warm breath of the earth itself. His folly had become their foundation, a legacy of warmth buried deep in the soil, ready for any winter the heavens dared to send.